psychology, psychology,
Let me ask you something. If you were trapped in a blizzard on a mountainside in the middle of the night, would you ever leave your shelter? Not walk out, not unzip the door, but cut your way out from the inside, barefoot, underdressed, into temperatures that would kill you in minutes? Because that's what 9 experienced hikers did. And that's the part of this story that refuses to behave. They weren't reckless. They weren't untrained. They weren't panicking tourists who didn't understand winter. They were engineers, athletes, radio technicians, and veterans. People who had crossed frozen terrain before and lived to talk about it. People who knew intimately how cold kills. And yet, sometime after midnight, on a slope locals call Dead Mountain, they made a decision that violated every survival rule they knew. They didn't grab their boots. They didn't grab their coats. They didn't even grab any food. They didn't open the tent properly. They cut their way out and walked into the dark. Not running, not screaming, walking together. That's the detail I can't let go of, because fear makes people scatter. Panic makes people chaotic. But this was organized, coordinated, almost calm, which means whatever happened didn't just scare them, it convinced them. And here's where this story changes, because the question isn't what they ran from. No avalanche, no creature, no secret weapon has ever fully explained that choice. The real question is this: what has to happen inside your mind for experience, training, and survival instinct to all fail at the same time? Because winter doesn't just freeze bodies. It bends perception. It distorts judgment. It erodes the brain's ability to tell the difference between danger and the idea of danger. I'm Tara Peralt, a doctoral student at the University of South Florida, and I want to talk about the moment where environment becomes a psychological threat, where the mountain doesn't attack, it becomes unreadable. Because when people can't make sense of what's happening around them, the mind doesn't stay calm. It breaks patterns. It invents meaning. It prioritizes escape over survival. And once perception collapses, the cold doesn't need to chase you. It only needs to wait. They were not reckless. That's the first thing investigators wrote down. These were not teenagers chasing a thrill or tourists unfamiliar with winter. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Engineers, radio technicians, physicists, and athletes. Several were veterans of long-distance winter expeditions. One had survived the siege of Leningrad. Another was a decorated World War II veteran. They knew how cold kills. They knew how fast panic spread. They knew how thin the margin for error is in winter. This expedition wasn't optional. It was a qualification journey, the final requirement for the highest hiking certification in the Soviet Union. To earn it, they had to cross remote terrain in extreme conditions and return with documentation. So they documented everything. They kept detailed journals. They logged weather changes. They recorded altitude and distance. They joked in the margins of their notes. In photographs, they looked relaxed, familiar, comfortable with one another. There's laughter, teasing, playful expressions. A group dynamic built on trust. Nothing about the early days suggested dread. They traveled by train, then by truck, then by foot. At the last settlement, they mailed postcards home. One wrote, "If something happens, blame the cold. It was meant to be a joke." They entered the mountains on January 27th. By January 31st, one member turned back due to illness. That decision likely saved his life. The remaining 9 continued. On February 1st, visibility dropped. Snowfall thickened. Winds accelerated. The kind of wind that doesn't just chill, it disorients. Sounds bend, directions become unreliable, and the horizon disappears. They reached the slope of Dead Mountain. The name was not poetic. It was quite literal. Local Mansi people avoided it. The group debated descending into the forest for shelter. Trees would block the wind. Firewood was available. But descending meant losing elevation they'd have to regain the next day. They chose to camp on the slope instead. They built their tent carefully, anchoring it against the wind. Inside, they laid out their boots in a line. Their coats were folded nearby. Cameras were stored safely, and food was rationed. There was no sign of urgency. They ate, they wrote, they laughed. Then, night closed in. Wind scoured the mountain. Snow blew sideways. The temperature dropped to at least minus 30 degrees Celsius. Inside the tent, condensation froze against the canvas walls. Breathing would have been shallow, careful, and controlled. At some point, likely between midnight and 2 a.m., something interrupted that calm. We don't know what it was, but we do know what they did. They cut their way out of the tent. The slashes were long and deliberate, and made from the inside. Not frantic tears, controlled strokes. They did not open the entrance. They did not put on boots, and they did not retrieve their coats. They exited into lethal cold, wearing socks, underwear, and light sweaters. Some were even barefoot. This was not a rational survival choice, but it was a coordinated one. Their footprints showed they walked downhill together, not running or tumbling, a staggered line, side by side at times, for nearly a half a mile into the forest. At the tree line, something fractured. 2 bodies were found beneath a massive pine tree. Their skin was gray. Their hands were burned, as if they'd pressed them into a flame too long. Above them, branches were broken up to 5 meters high. They had climbed, probably not to flee, but to look towards the slope, towards the tent, as if trying to see what they left behind. 3 others were found between the tree and the campsite. They lay face down in the snow, spaced apart, frozen mid-movement. One had a clenched fist. Another's arm was raised, as if shielding his face. They had tried to return, but they never made it. The last 4 were not found until May, when the snow began to melt. They lay in a ravine, partially covered by snow and ice. Their injuries were nothing short of catastrophic. Ribs crushed inward, skulls fractured with force comparable to a car accident. But there were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises consistent with assault, no defensive injuries. One woman was missing her tongue, another her eyes. Soft tissue damage consistent with post-mortem exposure, but deeply unsettling nonetheless. Their clothing told a final story. Some wore pieces taken from the dead, a jacket here, a sweater there. This redistribution suggests logic finally returned, albeit briefly. They had tried, too late, to survive. Radiation was detected on some garments, not enough to kill, but enough to raise questions no one answered. The investigation stalled. Officials concluded the group died due to a compelling natural force. The case was closed, but Dyatlov Pass never closed, because it wasn't the injuries that unsettled people. It was the decision. 9 experienced hikers chose to abandon shelter in deadly cold. They chose exposure over protection. They chose to walk into darkness rather than to stay. Whatever happened didn't chase them. It didn't tear the tent apart. It didn't drag them screaming into the night. It convinced them. And that's what keeps this story alive. Because if something can override someone's judgment so completely, if fear, confusion, or perception itself can fracture group survival instincts, then the mountain didn't kill them. Their minds turned first, and winter simply finished the work. The Dyatlov Pass incident is often treated like a puzzle to be solved, avalanche or not, infrasound or not, military testing or not. But psychologically, the most important question isn't what happened to them. It's what happened inside of them. Because whatever drove 9 experienced hikers out of a tent and into lethal cold didn't just frighten them. It dismantled the systems that normally keep people alive in winter. Fear alone doesn't do that. Panic alone doesn't do that. Something far more destabilizing had to be at work. We tend to think of winter as a physical threat: cold, snow, exposure. But winter is also a neurological environment. Prolonged cold changes how the brain processes information. Blood flow shifts away from extremities and towards the core. But that redistribution doesn't spare higher cognition. Decision-making slows. Risk assessment narrows. Time perception distorts. The brain becomes more reactive and less predictive. Add darkness, wind, and isolation, and the nervous system enters a state of chronic vigilance. Not the sharp panic of immediate danger, but the grinding, exhausting awareness that something is wrong and cannot be located. This matters because survival depends on the ability to correctly identify threats. When the brain can't do that, it doesn't relax. It destabilizes. In whiteout conditions, the brain loses reliable sensory anchors. Snow reflects sound, wind masks the direction, and the horizon disappears. Depth perception collapses. Even familiar landmarks become unrecognizable. This is not just disorientation. It's perceptual ambiguity, one of the most psychologically intolerable states for people. The mind is a prediction machine. It constantly asks, what is happening? What happens next? And when it can't answer those questions, anxiety spikes, not as fear, but as a cognitive threat. People don't just feel afraid, they feel wrong. This can lead to something called apophenia. This is the brain's tendency to detect patterns, agents, or intentions where none are clearly present. In ambiguous environments, the mind begins to fill in gaps with imagined causes, not delusions in the clinical sense, more like an overwhelming sense that something is approaching and watching or about to happen. The mountain doesn't need to attack. It only needs to become unreadable. The tent is the most important object in this story because leaving it was not an act of chaos. It was an act of consensus. Cutting the tent from the inside suggests urgency without frenzy. This wasn't one person panicking while others followed. This was a shared decision made under distorted perception. In group psychology, there is a phenomenon where uncertainty spreads faster than fear. When no one can clearly interpret a threat, people look to one another for cues. If enough individuals sense something is wrong but can't articulate it, the group can converge on a decision that feels necessary without being rational. This is how evacuations happen in the absence of visible danger, not because the threat is real, but because the inability to explain it becomes the threat. Leaving the tent may have felt safer than staying in a place where perception itself had become unreliable. Once they left the tent, the normal hierarchy of survival unraveled. Experienced hikers know, shelter first, then fire, then movement. But cognitive overload disrupts this hierarchy. Under extreme stress, the brain prioritizes escape from perceived threat over long-term survival planning. This is why they walked instead of ran, why they stayed together, why they moved downhill towards the trees. The forest represented structure, contrast, edges, orientation. It wasn't warmth they were seeking, it was legibility, something the mountain had taken away. The most haunting part of Dyatlov Pass isn't the initial flight. It's what happened afterwards. At the tree line, the group splintered. And with that fragmentation, logic briefly returned. Fire was attempted, clothing was redistributed, some tried to return to the tent. This suggests that whatever state had driven them out was temporary, not permanent, a surge, not a psychosis, a shared collapse that loosened its grip once the environment changed. But by then, the damage was done. Cold doesn't forgive delayed insight. The injuries are also important. The blunt force trauma found in the ravine is often treated as evidence of some external force, but it speaks to desperation and terrain more so than attack. In low visibility and deep snow, Falls become catastrophic. Bodies lose the ability to brace. Pain perception dulls. Damage accumulates without immediate awareness. The absence of defensive wounds support this. They weren't fighting something. They were fighting the environment and losing the ability to interpret it accurately. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is best understood not as a mystery, but as a threshold event. The moment where cognition under prolonged winter stress crossed from adaptation into failure. No single cause, no single hallucination, just a cascade of small distortions that aligned long enough to override survival logic. This is why the case resists explanation, because nothing happened in the way we want it to. Winter didn't strike, the mountain didn't attack. The environment became psychologically uninhabitable. And as for the radiation is one of those details that refuses to stay quiet, because it doesn't belong in a winter survival story. And our brains notice that immediately, at least mine did. During the investigation, trace levels of radiation were detected on the clothing of 2 members of the group. Not all 9, not on their bodies, not in the soil, not in the surrounding environment, just on certain garments. That unevenness matters. If the mountain itself had been radioactive, everyone would have shown exposure. If there had been a massive external radiation event, it would have left a broader signature: burns, sickness, widespread contamination. But none of that was present. Instead, what investigators found were low-level traces consistent with occupational exposure. Several members of the group had previously worked in industrial or research settings tied to nuclear facilities, which, in the Soviet Union at the time, was not unusual for engineering students. In other words, the radiation likely predated the expedition. But psychologically, that explanation doesn't satisfy us, because it feels too mundane for a story this disturbing, and that's important too. Radiation triggers the same fear mechanisms as unseen predators or supernatural forces. You can't see it approaching. You can't feel it until it's already done harm. It violates our expectation that danger announces itself. So when people hear radiation in the Dyatlov case, the mind automatically leaps to hidden agents, secret forces, things operating just beyond perception. That doesn't mean those explanations are correct. It means the detail activates the same cognitive alarms as the night itself. What's fascinating is that the radiation didn't cause the deaths, but it became central to how the story was remembered, because it reinforced the sense that something unseen had been present. Not a monster, not an avalanche, not an attacker, but an invisible influence. This mirrors exactly what happened on the mountain. The hikers weren't responding to something they could clearly identify. They were responding to something they couldn't locate. That radiation detail echoes the same structure, an anomaly that doesn't explain the event, but makes the event feel more intentional, more designed, and more meaningful. From a cognitive standpoint, the radiation serves as a symbolic function. When people encounter extreme, senseless loss, the mind searches for causality that matches the emotional weight of the outcome. Random cold feels insufficient. Disorientation feels incomplete. Environmental failure feels unsatisfying. Radiation feels different. It implies purpose. It implies intrusion. It implies something operating outside ordinary experience. So even when the evidence points towards a benign origin, the mind resists letting go, because the story feels like it should have a darker cause. Dyatlov endures because it exposes something we don't like to admit: that human rationality is not fixed, that experience doesn't shield us, that under the right conditions, perception itself can become the enemy. 9 people didn't die because they were careless. They died because winter didn't just surround them, it entered their decision-making. And once that happens, survival becomes a matter of timing, not intelligence. The mountain didn't need to kill them. It only needed to wait.